Anyway, well, someone else who takes a lot of unpopular views and a lot of hits is Chris Hedges.
Yeah, Chris is sort of the standard bearer for being willing to be unpopular and going against the grain. And so we're gonna talk to him. And just to preface this, one of the things I love about Chris is, like, a really good reporter, there has to be an element of just wanting to zag when everyone else is zigging. You know what I mean? Like, there has to be the not just the willingness, but the desire to go against the grain. And Chris kind of has always been that person. He's gone to places that nobody else wants to go. And so I think he embodies a lot of qualities that are really, really kind of going out of style in the business. And so we're going to talk to him about all that stuff. We're joined today by a very special guest, the celebrated war correspondent, one of my heroes in journalism, Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize winner. He's going to talk to us about a whole bunch of stuff today. But we think we should start off by what you were doing yesterday down on Wall Street. Tell us about the protest, Extinction Rebellion, the history of it, what happened.
So Extinction Rebellion is a British-based group. It's about a year old. And it, I think, has come to the very correct conclusion that the ruling elites are incapable of reform. And appealing to their better nature is a waste of time because they don't have one, and that as a species we're completely fucked, even if we stop all carbon emissions today, which isn't happening, and therefore our last best chance is to disrupt the machine, to carry out sustained acts of civil disobedience. Extinction Rebellion is a much more robust organization in Great Britain. Mm-hmm. So the goal is to really shut down the center of London, especially around Westminster, for 3 weeks. They shut down London, large parts of London, in April for 10 days with 1,000 arrests. Wow. And I think that's it. I think that that's the only hope. So I was with them and gave one of my diatribes.
Yeah, tell us about your diatribe. It sounded kind of like a classic Hedges.
It was, right. Everything's a sermon. That's what happens. And
we should point out, we're going to get into this, but you were a minister. You went to divinity school.
I did. Yeah. And but I asked the question, who are these people behind me in this temple of greed? I probably lifted that from one of your books. And we know
trademark.
We know who they are. Mm-hmm. They were the slaveholders. They were the robber barons and the railroad magnates that stole indigenous land and killed indigenous people and slaughtered the buffalo herds. They are the industrialists who gunned down hundreds of American workers who were trying to organize at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. They are the people who unleashed the reign of terror against black people through black codes and lynching. That's who they are. And I went, and then I asked, who are we?
Right.
And where do we come from? We came from Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner and John Brown and Harriet Tubman and Malcolm and Martin and Eugene V. Debs, and we're often defeated. Mm-hmm. But I closed by saying, that I don't know if we're going to succeed, but these corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. And in the end, I don't fight fascists because I'm going to win. I fight fascists because they're fascists.
Right. And you did this down on Wall Street, right? The symbolism.
It was perfect. It was a beautiful set. Hopefully somebody filmed it.
Is the girl in front of the bowl still there?
We were a little up. We were a little down from that, so it was right in front of the New York Stock Exchange. Yeah. A lot of people had a die-in, and they'd splattered blood with holding signs to commemorating those who had died in the climate disasters, flooding, wildfires, etc.
She's my favorite neoliberal feminist monument.
The girl
standing in front of the bull, which is funny because I don't know how she's going to defeat the bull. She's just standing in front of it.
Which like it's charge at it?
Yeah, I mean it's a great symbol in a way, right? Of like the co-opting of feminism and activism by capitalism. But it's supposed to be like a lean-in little girl.
Right.
She's going to lean in for the last time. Unfortunately, yeah. I just had Christian Parenti on, by the way, who wrote this great piece in Jacobin about environmentalism and Marxist environmentalism, and also how we can fight climate change without self-loathing, which is an interesting proposition.
How do you do it without suffering?
Well, he was saying that you reminded me of it when you mentioned the buffalo, but he was saying that, human beings and interact with the environment, and that per se isn't bad. It's the capitalist interaction with the environment. And so we don't have to make it man or humans against nature.
Well, it's the treating of the environment as an inert commodity that you exploit until exhaustion or collapse.
Yeah.
And his book, the name escapes me, which I read.
Tropic of Chaos?
Yeah, Tropic of Chaos is quite good.
Yeah.
It's a very good book.
Yeah.
Chris has read basically every book.
No, I hang out with Cornel West. So
oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's it always is very humbling because he has read every book.
Right.
And then chastises me for not.
For things
Really?
you didn't
You ever
read.
read Schopenhauer? I call him?
Brother Chris? Does he call you Brother Chris?
Well, we're close. He just
okay.
calls me Chris, yeah.
Schopenhauer.
Sometimes
Do you
brother.
find Schopenhauer funny? I find Schopenhauer very funny.
Do you?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I haven't read Schopenhauer. so-
Really?
Yeah.
Or not much of it. Yeah.
Huh.
Should I go read it?
I mean,
You should do a reading now.
It's so dark that it goes over into being funny, but maybe not everybody would think that.
Well, that's kind of like Kierkegaard.
right.
Who I do
yeah,
like.
yeah.
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 Who said it? Kierkegaard or Schopenhauer? We
Should
could have a
contest later. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. All right. So how did you get into journalism? Let's go back to your background. Your father was a minister, right?
Yeah.
You talked about this. So it wasn't your intention to go into journalism, was it?
Well, it was my intention to be a writer.
Writer, yeah,
So I always
exactly, yeah.
wrote. I mean, for the age of 4, I knew what I wanted to be. But I had this, and I published my first piece when I was 12 in a historical journal. It was the history of my father's church, which was very old. And then I published my first piece in a major newspaper when I was in college, in the Christian Science Monitor.
Oh.
You want to hear that story?
Yeah,
It's
well,
long.
yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
long
no,
story.
let's do it, yeah.
Okay, so
You were in Boston, right? So at the time. Right?
no, I was in. So I went to college at Colgate, so
Okay.
upstate New York, and I got a internship on the House Foreign Affairs Committee for the summer,
Okay.
on the subcommittee on international development, and so somehow, rather than answer letters, I got myself into a position where it was done during the Carter presidency. I was writing a case study of Gulf and Western and how they treated sweatshop workers in La Romana in the Dominican Republic, and they were killing them. They were shooting. The labor union leaders were being murdered, found dead in a ditch. And so I found this guy. His name was Sasha Volman. He'd been like a partisan leader in Romania during World War II, and then so he was one of these European socialists who hated communism, and he went to the Dominican Republic and became a huge CIA asset. So he, was fighting, quote unquote, the communists, but at the same time he hated the big corporations. And he was in a hospital in Georgetown having some pretty serious surgery, like his gallbladder removed or something. And I found him, and he had all the dirt on Gulf and Western, and he gave it to me. I mean, just dirty, dirty stuff.
Wow.
And so one day I'm in the congressman's office. This was Michael Harrington from North Shore, Boston, and 2 guys in suits come in from Gulf and Western, which was all mobbed up with Charlie Bluedorn. And next thing you know, I'm called into the administrative assistant's office, and I'm fired from my unpaid internship. And I go around and collect donations from all the rest of the interns and hitchhike to Miami
Wow.
to go to the Dominican Republic. Yeah, I'm going to tell you the whole uncensored version. And there was this very beautiful French-American woman named Jeannot, and somehow
This is a movie. Isn't
I
it?
know.
convinced her to go with me.
Whoa.
But I honestly blocked out what my argument was.
Argument, I like
a year
it.
later, I had lunch with her. She lives in Boston when I was on a fellowship at Harvard. I said, Jenna, why did you go with me? She goes, oh, but you told me the congressman said I had to go. I don't remember saying that. I honestly don't.
Well, it's effective.
Anyway,
Yeah.
off we
It
went.
was civic duty.
Yeah.
Civic duty.
Hitchhiking through Georgia with a blonde ponytail, not a good idea. And we got to Florida, then we flew to the Dominican Republic, and she was a Baha'i and went to a Baha'i retreat. And so I was going to go out and finish the work, the investigative work to write this piece about Gulf and Western and how they were breaking and murdering labor union leaders. And I had no money, I had no resources. I'm staying in a little dormitory for the sons of Haitian cane cutters, run by the Episcopal Church in Santo Domingo. I come out the first day. I run into an American woman who's the organist. She introduces herself as Tamaño. I said, oh, you mean like Francisco Camaño? the guy who was a colonel in 1965, the U.S. Marines invade,
right.
he goes to Cuba, he raises a rebel force, he comes back, the Green Berets land and wipe him out. He said, yeah, it was my husband's brother.
Wow.
And so I tell her what I'm trying to do. And she said, well, my daughter, Liliana, I was like 19 or something, who was in her 30s, has just gotten divorced and was back.
Janae, better look out.
Well, no, she's off at a Baha'i retreat, so I'm on
got
my
it.
own.
Good timing.
And she was a firecracker, this woman. So they lend me the family car. We go out there, and we are going to all these sweatshops where the foreman had these. They were almost the size of baseball bats and would beat the workers.
Wow.
And they were what were they that they were?
Well, they were. It was textiles. It was La Romana was a big sweatshop
Right.
area.
But what were they beating them with that were
They were like big truncheons, but they were bigger
I
than
missed
truncheons.
that word. Got it. Sorry.
And at one point, they started beating on it. I decided to take a picture, and that was it. So the goons started, except that I ran track, and I was very good, and they couldn't catch me. And so then it starts to rain, because it's right on the coast. You know, these thunderstorms come in like freight trains. And so I think her name was Liliana. She's driving up and down on the dirt roads, and I'm trying to get to the car before the goons get me. And she's screaming, "Don't touch him, I'm a Camano." And finally I make a run for it. I get in the car, and we drive, I think it was about 3 hours, if I remember, back to San Domingo. About 2 hours we stop at this beer shack, and drink a lot of beer. And then come out, and it's the rain stopped, and it's feral, so the steam is coming up from the vegetation. And she pulls me up next to the car and says, "Did I ever tell you I have a tattoo?" I said, "No." She said, "You want to see it?" I said, "Sure." And she unzips her pants, and she has like a butterfly or something tattoo right there. And that's when I knew I wanted to be a foreign correspondent.
Nice.
And I published
wow,
it.
That's great.
Yeah, I published it in the Christian Science Monitor. But
Did you publish the photo as well and all that?
No. It was the Christian Science Monitor.
Oh, right.
Don't you know?
No, yeah.
Yeah, they never talk about sex or death.
Huh.
Yeah.
Everything in between, right?
Yeah.
But, my father was a social activist. He was involved in the anti-war movement. He was a World War II vet. He came back from the war pretty much a pacifist. He'd been in North Africa. He was very involved in the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement. And I couldn't reconcile the quote-unquote objectivity of American journalism. I cared about writing and loved writing. But I wasn't really objective about injustice, suffering, human misery. And so I did go to divinity school at Harvard. And then after 2 years, I kind of had, and I always say Harvard's where I learned to hate liberals.
We talked about this because you were on the T, right?
I lived in Roxbury.
Yeah.
So I was running a small church there in a very bad part of Boston, right across from Mission Extension Housing Project. And so commuting into Cambridge every day with classmates who talked about empowering people they'd never met.
Right.
Or they liked the poor, but they don't like the smell of the poor. So, and they'd all go off.
Clara Jeffrey.
Yeah, they'd go to Nicaragua and pick coffee for a week with the Sandinistas and spend the rest of the semester talking about it.
But they wouldn't cross the Charles.
Yeah, they wouldn't take
Right.
the Green Line.
Yeah.
So I took a year off. I went and studied Spanish with the Maryknoll Fathers. I freelanced, ended up writing stuff for the Washington Post, ended up absolutely broke in Buenos Aires, was actually trying to get a job on a freighter so I could work my way back to New York City, and the Falkland War broke out, and I was in Buenos Aires, so I ended up doing NPR, the Yorkshire Post, the Baltimore Sun. I mean, I went from like living on $50 a month to making $600 a day. And like all people who have never had money, of course, I threw away my clothes and bought like the most gaudy.
Yeah, the worst clothes you can possibly find.
Yeah, the worst clothes you could possibly find. And it was Argentina, so you can imagine how bad those were. I had a...
You have photos?
No, thank God I don't. I had a reserved table at La Recoleta discotheque.
Wow.
I developed a very expensive cigar habit.
Could have been worse.
So by the end of 3 months, I made a fortune and it was all gone. And I didn't even really buy anything. But I don't regret it.
To get back to how your career started, I always, when young people ask me how do you get into journalism, I always
say don't.
Yeah, well, that's the first thing I say. Go to med school. Yeah, you can't go to med school. Just move overseas to someplace interesting,
Yeah, but that doesn't work anymore, Matt.
it doesn't work anymore. That's true. But
Because there's no money?
it did in
It did
your
for
day.
me.
It did in
Sure.
my day,
Yeah,
right?
because, well, you were in Russia. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, because there were outlets. I mean,
Right.
the Boston Globe had a foreign section. The Philadelphia Inquirer had a foreign section.
And everybody needed stringers.
Everybody needed stringers. So, I mean, I began as a stringer and then eventually was hired as a full-time employee. But that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, when I was in Salvador, every network had a bureau. They had reporters. They had producers. It's all gone.
Yeah.
Vanished.
Yeah.
Up in smoke.
That was a way into the business back then. Was just going to hotspots.
Sure,
there weren't a lot of
Salvador-
journalists who wanted to go to these places.
That's right.
Right.
Well, that's the great thing.
Yeah.
And that was great for my career at the Times because all the jobs that I wanted, nobody else wanted.
Right.
Like when I volunteered to go to Sarajevo, the executive editor, Joe Lelyveld, said, well, I guess the line starts and ends with you, which was great. So they don't want to go there. All want to go to Paris, or they want to hang out in Washington.
Well, that was natural at that time because it wasn't exactly the safest place to be
No, it
in
wasn't very
Sarajevo.
well.
Yeah.
45 reporters had been killed by the time I got there, yeah.
Right. But it was a great. There was a lot of opportunity for reporters back then because there was still this appetite
Yes.
to get the on the ground thing, and it's kind of a hole in the system a little bit, right? Because the editors don't exactly know what's going on. They still actually need the person on the ground to tell them the who, what, and where, and
Right,
why.
and the great thing about it is it's called sat phones. Mm-hmm. Since you can't fire it up, they have to leave you alone. I mean, when I would go out in Bosnia with my sat phone, I didn't have electricity, so I had 4 hours, if I remember correctly, battery.
What's a sat phone?
A satellite phone. So I would set it up. My photographer would send. He could send over the sat phone. I'd send. Then we have to turn it off.
Right.
They can't come for you.
Right.
It's great.
So go and do your work, come back, give us something, right? And you kind of existed for a long time at the Times in this kind of weird gray area where you were on the front page regularly.
Yeah,
and you
well,
were
they
reporting
need
from the Middle
people
East.
like that. What they don't want is you in the newsroom.
Right. Right.
That never works out really well.
Yeah. So we were talking before about the first Gulf War, and I think this is really interesting because this is kind of a metaphor for your whole career. Everybody else was doing this new form of reporting, this kind of embedded pool reporting, right?
Yeah, well, it was even worse than that. So, so the first Gulf War, the people running the military press operations all came out of Vietnam. And for them, the press was the fifth column.
Right.
What they didn't realize is that everybody was over there. This was a whole new generation, and they were all over there to lick the boots of the military.
Right.
Yeah, they just and lionize Schwarzkopf, who was a drunk, and et cetera, et cetera. And the
Storm and
army
Norman.
was so clueless they couldn't figure it out. So they thought the press was the enemy. In fact, the press just wanted to do their part, which is what the press always does in war, especially at the inception of wars. And Philip Knightley wrote quite a fine book on it called The First Casualty, which is truth. Obviously, first of all, I speak Arabic, so I was not about to do the pool. I figured I came here to be a reporter. If I can't be a reporter, it would throw me out. So I started going off. I actually got a Marine Corps uniform, and so I could go through the checkpoints and sleep out in the desert with Bedouins. I speak Arabic, and I start filing these stories, and I kind of shatter the storyline that the reporters, including the New York Times reporters, were feeding their editors. We can't go anywhere. We can't. And they got really angry. And so all of the reporters, New York Times reporters, I think there were 5 of them, wrote a letter to the foreign editor and said that I was ruining our relationship with the military.
Because you weren't going by the pool strictures.
I wasn't doing the way the pool worked is they'd take just a few people out, and then they'd come back, and everybody would write up what they saw, and then everybody would sit in the hotel and write it. I mean, it was ridiculous.
That's what happens in campaigns too. It's essentially. Right.
Yeah. So I never. You do campaigns. I don't know why. I don't want to go any near them.
But it's the same system.
Oh, it's like the White House. You don't even. People don't have to. Who knows what Trump does? But before, you never had to. Reporters in the White House didn't take notes because in real time they just would hand them what The only advantage I could see from a distance of being a White House reporter is that you get to introduce your mother to the president. Otherwise, it's just a stenography. I mean, It's just the most, and not only that, but it's humiliating stenography. Yeah.
Unless you're Helen Thomas, I guess, right?
Huh?
Unless you're Helen Thomas.
Well, look what they did to her.
I know,
Come
right?
on.
she was one of the exceptions.
But I mean, basically, they were reacting to Vietnam because during Vietnam,
not in the beginning of Vietnam. What people don't remember is that everybody went in to do their part,
right?
And then what people don't understand about the press is that you're an exception, but it is largely a reactive force. It reacts. It's not a pioneering. It's not like the press told the truth about Vietnam. What happened was the body bags started coming home, and public perceptions of the war changed. And then Walter Cronkite goes on the air, of course, after public perceptions have changed, to criticize the war. And so the latter part of the war, the press was freed to write honestly about the war, or at least not completely honest, but more honest.
Yeah, they were at least allowed to have the take. We might not win this, right?
Well, they also covered atrocities.
Yeah,
I mean,
some of them.
So,
Agent Orange. I mean, they got around to that, right?
Yeah. I mean, now Nick Turst did a good book, Kill Anything That Moves, which goes back and looks at the Army records, the reports. So, I mean, Vietnam was just one huge atrocity. I mean, they didn't begin to come close to explaining the reality, but at least they hinted at it. That they weren't doing at the beginning. So the Army, these people who would have been young lieutenants or something, bought this line, the stabbed in the back theory, that we would have won the war, but for, And so that was the funny part, is that they were making war on a press. I mean, the whole pool system was administered by my colleagues, and it couldn't have functioned without them. And they administered it because, despite what they told their editors, they wanted it. And having spent 20 years in war zones, I can tell you only about 10 or 15% of reporters really want to go out. Right. The rest don't. They're handout. They get handouts. That's the honest people in war are photographers, and they also have the highest casualty rate because they have to get out.
Right.
But the reporters, they're...
So, but you think that that system, and I'm sorry to dwell on this, but I just find it so interesting. Part of it seems to me, I was embedded in the Iraq War, and it felt like part of the strategy there was to make you feel dependent upon the people who you were embedded with.
None of that. It's like a Boy Scout. It's like you're weak with Boy Scouts.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
And, of course, most of these reporters have never been anywhere near a war and are, like, shitting their pants. And they want to be part of the team. Yeah, it's really, it really, unfortunately, feeds every stereotype of wimpy journalists. Now, by the time I got to the Gulf, I'd already been in more combat than anybody unless they'd been in Vietnam. Those people were all colonels and up. And I spoke the language, and so I didn't need it, and I didn't want it. But once you depend on them for logistics, once you depend on them for security, food, literally every aspect, what are you going to write?
Right.
I mean, are you,
totally.
if you're, I know reporters who were embedded in units after they took Baghdad, and a lot of these cars, they were nervous. So, if a car would come too quickly at a checkpoint, they'd quote unquote light it up, which meant, and it usually meant they just killed a family of 6 or something.
Right.
These reporters never wrote that. I'm not going to name them, but I know who they are. They told me because they'd instantly be unembedded.
Right.
And that's the first problem. The second problem is that you only see the war from the perspective, their perspective. So they're off, firing 90 millimeter tank rounds at a village. You don't see the result.
Right.
And I'm not actually against embedding. I think it is an aspect of war reporting, but when that's the only war reporting, then you don't have a clue as to what's going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So you think it should be like you should alternate sides, or
I
have
don't want to do
different?
it. I don't embed.
No, but what do you think the
No, I think you got to have people.
Is?
Well, so when I went out on my own, Dick Cheney was the defense secretary, and they invented this term for people like me called the unilaterals, a new term for being a reporter. And before the invasion of Kuwait, Cheney sent out a list of I think it wasn't a long list, 10 or 15 of us that he wanted expelled from Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
Before the invasion. I was right up at the top.
That's a badge of honor.
Yeah, but the funny part is they couldn't find me. They had 500,000 troops, and they never found me.
But when you say that you don't think embedding is bad, so how is it that
I think it's an aspect of the war, but almost a tangential one. So you're always going to have reporters that want to embed. That's fine, but you can't cover a war when your entire all of the reporting on that war is done by embedded reporters. You don't really know what's going on.
So ideally, you would have, let's say, imagining that newspapers still kind of.
Well, you'd have reporters who are out on their own. It's more dangerous. I mean, it's obviously more dangerous.
So would one paper have, ideally, one paper would have someone embedded, someone on their own, someone embedded with the actual native population or indigenous there? Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So you went on, you were based in Cairo for a while after that, right?
4 years.
4 years.
How did you learn Arabic?
So I was with the Dallas Morning News in Central America, and I decided I wanted to spend the rest of my life in Latin America. It's a wonderful culture. I speak Spanish. But I couldn't get them to open a bureau in South America, so they offered me London or Jerusalem. I didn't want to go to London, cover the royal family or something. So I said I would go to Jerusalem if I could take a sabbatical and study Arabic.
Oh, that's cool.
And I convinced the editors of the Dallas Morning News that the best place to study Arabic was that great center of Arabic learning, Switzerland.
Oh.
So I went to Lausanne and studied Arabic. My first wife was Swiss, and then I later took courses at Hebrew University. Yeah.
And plus, it enriches your Spanish because of all the AL words that have Arabic roots.
Yeah, there you go.
And lastly, I guess we should ask about the impeachment drama. You had a fascinating go back and forth on Democracy Now! Last week. I think we actually may disagree on this one a little bit, but what's your take on this? Because I think it's a complicated story. Obviously, to me, it's like it's basically a story about dueling elite narratives.
Of course
right?
it is, because neither party has defended the rule of law. Mm. From the first week Trump was in office, you could have impeached him on the Emoluments Clause alone, inciting racism, using tax laws to go after his political enemies, Bezos, who's a shit at Amazon, obstructing justice. I mean, obstruction, which the Mueller report, was a kind of Trojan horse, but he did try to obstruct justice.
Yeah, I think you could.
Yeah,
you could make the argument.
But none of that mattered until you touched the anointed candidate of the Democratic Party donor class, which was Biden. Right. So in that sense, it's like Watergate. Right. So all of the crimes of the Nixon White House are being carried out against the anti-war movement, the peace movement, and Ellsberg's
Cambodians,
But as soon as you touch the Democratic establishment, then, and that's what's happened. I mean, they may get them. Mm-hmm. They may get them, but as I wrote a piece called "The Problem with Impeachment," it's probably going to make things worse,
right?
Because the fundamental structures of our society, which have destroyed our democracy, the system of legalized bribery and corporate money, the collapse of the courts in the service of corporate power, wholly owned subsidiaries, the degradation and disintegration of the media as an effective force within a democracy, the wholesale security and surveillance state, the concentration of wealth and staggering social, none of that is going to change.
Right.
And that's where our problems come from. And so if you go after Trump and you don't address the underlying decay that gave us Trump, then you are going to exacerbate the antagonisms within the warring tribes. And look, we are headed towards, I think, political violence. And, Cesar Sayoc, if those pipe bombs had gone off, you would have decapitated the entire Democratic Party leadership. So, and the country's awash, 300 million weapons, 1.5 million, assault-style weapons, these AR-15s. Yeah, I mean, we have an average of a mass shooting every day. So and I think that the liberal class and the Democrats see this as the solution. They've personified all of their problems into Trump, and that's not only very short-sighted but very dangerous.
Right. And why do you think they didn't go after him with the Emoluments Clause?
We know why. I mean, because Pelosi didn't think it was politically expedient.
But why? Yeah, I guess the question is, why was that not politically expedient?
Well, because you have blue dog Democrats. You have all sorts of Democrats who are essentially, by thin margins taking seats in Trump territory. And if the Democratic Party is seen as essentially trying to carry out a vendetta against Trump. I think this is the reasoning of Pelosi and the Democratic Party leadership. This would hurt their their ability to maintain control of the House and perhaps take control of the Senate. So we know what her decision was, but that's as bad as the Republicans. Neither party is defending the rule of law.
Right.
They only defend the rule of law when it's convenient.
And then I guess this will give people the illusion of political protest a little bit. It's going to be this enormous drama. All their political energy is going to go into this thing that's not really about.
But even best case scenario for them, what happens, right? Like, do they think that the impeachment vote is going to go through?
Well, there are legends now. A lot of the op-ed pieces are basically saying, you never know, it's getting more popular, so we might actually get to the 2/3.
Yeah, and even if that happens, then what happens? Then Pence, if he's...
Well, as Noam Chomsky points out, Pence will be worse. Because, Donald Trump has no ideology, really.
And
But
he's
Pence
galvanized
does.
so much
Pence
opposition.
Pence is a Christian fascist.
Right. But he's not rude. He's polite.
He's a lot more dangerous than
No, I know. So I don't even know what the end game is.
They don't know what the end game is either. That's
yeah.
the problem.
Right.
They don't know what the end game is either.
Ratings. Chris, thank you so much for coming in. Really appreciate it.
Great.
And a great free-ranging discussion, and good luck. Really embodied something that Chomsky talked about in Manufacturing Consent, which is that the pressure isn't really so much, nobody comes and red pencils your copy and tells you not to write this or that. It's more about the point of hire, right? If you're the kind of person who doesn't kind of write what they want, you'll get a reputation for being a difficult person or emotional or one of these things, and you just kind of won't make your way up
they'll send you to night business.
Right.
That's what they did to Ray Bonner, something like that.
Or
obits or...
Right.
Yeah,
right.
something like that.
So what happened? What was your denouement with the New York Times? Because obviously you were writing front page stories. You did. You were covering all the major events overseas in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. You obviously one of their most valuable correspondents. You win the Pulitzer Prize, but there was tension, right? So what happened?
Well,
there?
because people like me, newspapers or news organizations need people with my characteristics, which is basically comes down to. If you go there, we'll kill you, and we go anyway.
Right.
Which doesn't really fit into the corporate mentality of the New York Times in the newsroom. Which is why good war correspondents never, ever go back to the newsroom. They always get pushed out.
Can you think of an example? I can't think of anybody.
No, because we're not really built like that.
Right.
So so it's always an uncomfortable relationship. On the part of the paper, but on the other hand, you're kind of a necessary evil. They need to put up with you because they need somebody that's going to drive into Sarajevo when it's being hit with 2,000 shells a day. I mean, and that's a personality type.
And it's not Brian Williams, right?
No.
Even though he pretended he'd been on the...
Brian? Yeah.
Remember that story about him being in a helicopter that wasn't so...
I want to apologize. I said I was traveling in an aircraft that was hit by RPG fire. I was instead in a following aircraft.
Most of the TV correspondents who came in to Sarajevo when I was there, who came in for like a 2-week thing, like Brian Williams, to credentialize themselves, spent all of their time in the nuclear bunker below the Sarajevoan shitting their pants.
Right.
Like in the titanium sphere.
No, there
basically.
is one. Yeah, below there was one. Yeah, they were they wouldn't even sleep upstairs. Yeah, they were.
I still couldn't believe he got caught and then rehabilitated.
Yeah, but these people aren't journalists. Come on. I mean, they're just celebrities.
They're
I mean, journalists don't make $10 million a year or whatever they pay these people.
Yeah. I almost don't begrudge them that, but yeah.
You don't begrudge them the $10 million?
Well, I guess maybe I should. Yeah.
Well, it's Faustian. I mean, they've completely sold their soul and their integrity. So, what were you asking me?
So, you're sort of fallout with the time. So, there's Iraq and...
Well, okay. I mean, on a more serious note, everybody has... you can't cover war for everybody. Everybody has a breaking point. I ended covering the war in Kosovo. I was a physical and emotional wreck.
How long were you there?
Well, I'd been 20 years overseas, from war to war to war. And I just couldn't do it anymore. And then my closest friend, who I'd worked with for 10 years, Kurt Schork, gets killed in an ambush in Sierra Leone. He was, by the way, the administrative assistant in the office of Michael Harrington's office who fired me.
Wow.
Isn't that like bizarre?
What a bizarre.
Isn't that like bizarre? Yeah.
Did you ever reflect on that with him?
Yeah, because then like in his 40s he decides to become a freelance reporter for Reuters in northern Iraq, and by that time I'm the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, and somebody said, "Oh, Kurt wants to see you." He was in Zaho, or I don't know where he was, somewhere, and I was going to see him the next day. I said, "Yeah, tell him if he needs any papers filed, I'll be there." So yeah, I just kind of broke down, and I had to stop. I took a Neiman Fellowship at Harvard, and I couldn't really do war anymore. And then comes the call to invade Iraq. Well, I spent months of my life in Iraq, 7 years in the Middle East. I realized, for all the reasons we know now, that this was insane and dangerous, and I spoke out against it, which reporters are not supposed to do. Although John Burns was cheerleading the war, it's
Balance.
like the NYPD. They have lists of rules that they decide whether they want to enforce or not.
Right.
It was kind of the same. So nobody ever said anything to Burns because he was, parroting the appropriate line. And then I gave a commencement address at Rockford College where I was booed off the stage.
The curfews, the armed clashes with angry crowds that leave scores of Iraqi dead. The military governor.
I mean, at one point, 1,000 people got up and started singing "God Bless America" to drown me out. Yeah, it's on YouTube. And they cut my mic, and then, like, at the end, these, like, couple guys from the graduating class get up to the podium and try and push me off. And so the right-wing media got a hold of that. And the way they do it is they lynch you. Well, you've written about this.
Yeah.
So every hour, it was like
Right.
me saying something for 30 seconds that was not patriotic. And Rush Limbaugh devoted like 4 days to me. And the Wall Street Journal wrote an editorial attacking me as a left-wing pacifist, which I'm not. I'm not a pacifist. And so the Times gave me a formal written reprimand, which under guild rules, you give the employee the reprimand, and then if they violate it, i.e. if I continued speaking out against the war, I'm fired. So I left before they fired me, yeah.
So was the reprimand about editorializing outside your lane?
It was about impugning the impartiality of the New York Times.
So I want to come back to that a little bit because clearly things are a little different at the Times now, right? I mean, they encourage everybody to have a social media presence, to give their opinion about all sorts of things.
Yeah, but so not really.
Right.
They can give their opinion as long as it is part of the dominant narrative,
Right.
i.e. Trump is a Russian agent. Being at war in the Middle East is a good thing. Yeah, I mean, it's what was it? Dorothy Parker said about Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress. It goes from A to B. So that's kind of it. It goes from A to B. You can have all the opinions you want as long as it goes from A to B.
As long as they're
But
within
even
there.
the people who have Twitter presences, I mean, that's supposed to be their outlet, maybe, but they are supposed to be. I mean, we've talked about this. That I think in some ways it's much scarier. Scarier than the Jennifer Rubins at the Washington Post or like the Bret Stephens at the New York Times are the, Sydney Embers at the New York Times, who claim to be objective, right? They still do claim to not be driven by their opinions, but of course they are. They just hide them.
Well, there's certain kinds of, they're very specific opinions, though. They're like the approved opinion.
They're approved opinions.
Yeah.
Sure, we can,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I always talk about Bernie, but it's very clear. You can just trace it through their representation of Sanders, or lack thereof.
Right.
He's either invisible or had a heart attack, and that's it.
Well, what did they do a piece a few weeks ago that dredged up every reference they could make to Noam Chomsky and the Sandinistas or something?
Oh yeah, that was great.
Sydney Ember.
She asked Sanders if he heard an anti-American chant when he was at a rally in Nicaragua, and if he had heard it, would he have stayed at the rally? That was her first question for Sanders.
Well, how about asking, since I was there,
Yeah.
how many people were raped, murdered
Yeah, of course.
by the Contras, who, this is just ridiculous.
Right. Both sides did it. It was both sides. And who one of her sources was? Who she asked, whose opinion she sought, was Otto Reich.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
But that's a classic worthy and unworthy victims thing that Chomsky talks
Yeah,
about, right?
Chomsky nails that completely.
The whole
Yeah.
Contras were,
Yeah.
they were.
Yeah. No,
right.
well, okay, let's steal Matt Taibbi without. So Matt Taibbi writes, the great author Matt Taibbi writes. No, you are a great author. So you correctly point out that priests are being killed in Central America by death squads who are funded by and backed by the United States, and then a priest is murdered in Poland at almost exactly the same time, and it's the great that is the perfect illustration of worthy and unworthy victims.
Right.
So we have that completely. Yeah.
And then Ember goes back and interviews one of the people who was doing PR, literally for the people murdering the priests. I mean, he worked for the Reagan administration.
Oh, right.
Like killing pro-Sandinista stories and killing anti-Contra stories.
Which they revive only because they only care now because it's somehow tangentially connected to Sanders.
Right,
which is something
but they still care in the wrong way.
Right, yeah,
like they're not.
exactly.
They still think the Sandinistas are the bad guys.
Well, let me tell you about the New York Times. There are no rules written on the side of the wall. But if you're an astute, i.e., careerist, you very quickly figure out what they want and what they don't. And if you give them what they want, you will be rewarded. And, the famous story is when they had the 1968 student takeover at Columbia University, and Abe Rosenthal got his butt up there as fast as he could to write about how they'd, defiled or destroyed the books in the president's library, stories like that. Well, that assured is rocketing the publisher who sat on the board of trustees at Columbia. So yeah, it's careerist. And so when I was hired by the Times, most people get vetted at the institution for usually up to a decade before they become a foreign correspondent. Because of the Arabic, I got hired. I was only in New York for 7 months, and I'm overseas. So what they want is before they send you out, they want to know that you've been domesticated.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And if that's the whole. And so those people who, Roger Cohen. He's the perfect example. They know exactly what to say, what the appropriate opinion is, and
they're reliable. Right.
Yeah, they're reliable to the power elites who run the paper and the power elites whom the hierarchy of the paper are in alliance with. Yeah.
One thing that this I want to segue to the work you've done since you left the Times, like your recent book, America: A Farewell Tour. I think it's really interesting. We talked before. Like when you were doing the reporting from Gaza, you talked about how. When you're there, there's just so many stories you just don't know what to do with. Like it's so overflowing with stuff. If you're in the right part of the world, or basically almost anywhere in the world, you can look in any direction and find a front page worthy story, right? But now, if you're here in America, you just go to any small town in this country, and it's just wall to wall misery, horror, and somehow it's just not appearing on the news, right? You like essentially. I feel like your reporting now on poverty in this country is essentially the same thing you were doing overseas, except it's here in America now, right? Yeah.
But it doesn't. You're right. That's the lives of the majority of Americans are not reflected in the commercial media at all.
Right.
And if you get glimpses of it, we make fun of them.
Right.
That's it.
They're being chased by cops in that show, right?
Or they're like on Jerry Springer, and they've slept with their cousin's daughter or whatever it is.
Right.
That's it. And so, and you've written about them too, and so it's just the vast majority of the American public who are really suffering are just cartoon figures. That's why I liked your book on Eric Garner so much. Who a flawed individual as we all are. And yet by the end, your heart just breaks for him, for his family, and for all the other Eric Garners and all the other people trapped in this system. So it's a very frightening time because those voices are not being heard. Those experiences are not being imparted. Even the physical reality that they live in is not disseminated through images. Yeah.
Right. But there, like for instance, your story. I think her name was Christine Pagano. I thought that was such an interesting way to do that story. Talk about the opiate crisis. You just followed her whole progression, right? From just beginning to take a few pills here and there.
And that's how it usually starts.
Right. And next thing you know, you're in Atlantic City being stabbed and raped at the same time. But that's that was such an affecting story, and yet why isn't one of those stories on television basically every day, right? I mean,
well, because it's a downer, and because it's all about profit. It's all about it's commercial. Look, I mean, now it was bad enough when you had newspaper empires, Hearst and everything else, but now it's different. Now you have like huge corporations, Viacom or whatever, and news is just one revenue stream of perhaps hundreds of revenue streams. And that revenue stream competes. And if you can't compete, you're replaced, which is how you get Zucker on CNN. CNN is just ESPN for politicians.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
Did you say that?
No, somebody said like Washington was Hollywood for ugly people, but it's the same
that's
concept,
the New York
right?
Times.
Is it? Yeah.
Can you set up the story because people who don't know it?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Can you talk about a little bit about Christine Pagano, or I mean, just that?
Well, I write. So the book, America: The Farewell Tour. It's based in the understanding by the sociologist Emile Durkheim, his great book called On Suicide, where he goes out in France and asks what is it that drives individuals or groups of people to engage in willfully self-destructive behavior, and he says it's this rupture of social bonds. That's where we get the term anomie.
Right.
And that's, of course, what's happened. That's the root. The social bonds have been ruptured. People feel they don't have a place. People feel they don't have a future. People are forced to live without dignity, and work is about dignity.
You talk about that in the Scranton chapter too, right? Like it's not just about paying a check.
It's not. That's
right. Yeah.
And so at that point, people begin to engage in behavior that is suicidal. That's what the opioid crisis, that's what the addiction to gambling is about, suicide, hate groups. Durkheim writes that people who seek the annihilation of others are always driven by feelings or desires for self-annihilation. And so she was kind of lost. Her father or stepfather, I can't remember, slept with one of her high school classmates. She felt ostracized in the minute. She starts taking pills. Next thing you know, she becomes a heroin addict and engages in prostitution and almost dies. And
numerous times.
Yeah, numerous times. So, that's. But I mean, go to Ohio. I don't know if you've been to Ohio, but I mean, or Southern West Virginia. I did a book with Joe Sacco called "Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt," out of the poorest pockets of the United States. But we go to these old coal camps, and it was like interviewing zombies. Everybody was on Oxycontin. I mean, people we interviewed, 30-year-old, like 2 weeks later, they died. It was. But that's like, and that's what happens when, that's why George Bernard Shaw says the greatest crime is poverty. And I've been all over the world. Poverty manifests itself in the same way. Mm-hmm. So we make, what Malcolm S. called our internal colonies, poor people of color are thrust into poverty. They engage in self-destructive behavior that everybody and now, of course, we're seeing it ripple out with the white working class who've come next. Right. But it's all the same. It's all the same disease. Yeah.
Right.
Which is a really unpopular take lately. It's become this taboo to kind of express any empathy towards the white working class amongst certain sectors, obviously. But there are a lot of people who will say, "Oh, you're catering to racism," which I think is a really dangerous narrative.
Yeah, it is, and I'm not excusing the behavior. First of all, half of my family comes from the white working class in Maine. I mean, gun racks, the whole bit. I would say they didn't like anybody who wasn't Protestant, white, and from Mechanic Falls. I mean, they hated all the people from Boston, right. Jews, Catholics. There was a long list. I mean, I love them. I mean, they're my family. But I kind of dealt with them because I said, go ahead, you can talk about gay people like that at home, but not in front of me. That's all right. But the suffering is real. I mean, you go up to these, and I remember these small towns in Maine from when I was a boy. They're gutted. The banks are closed up. There's one methamphetamine lab after another. It's really tragic. And we do ourselves a great disservice by not acknowledging that suffering. Now, why is the white working class so dangerous? Because as the theorists of revolution, Crane Brinton, Jeffrey Davies, and others have pointed out, revolution is not caused by poverty. Revolution is caused by a significant section of the population who are thrust into dire circumstances and believe that they have no possibility for advancement, that the expectations that they once had for themselves or their children are cut off.
It's the gap between expectations.
And so that's what we're seeing. And the longer the white working class is demonized, and the real issues, I was in Anderson, Indiana for the book, so a big GM center, and it's a wasteland. I mean, they didn't just abandon the plants; they tore them down. So these gigantic weed-choked lots where they used to have these gigantic plants, just behind cyclone fencing, and the city's in a death spiral, and of course the opioid, everything is, and they all voted for Sanders in the primary. They didn't. Right. And I was talking with the old UAW people. They said, "Okay, we know you're going to vote for Trump, but vote the Democratic slate for the state." They didn't even do that.
Right.
They weren't going to vote for Clinton.
Right.
I mean, we talk about lies that Trump. Trump lies like he breathes, but the lies that did the most damage came out of Clinton and Obama and the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and similarly, that's used as an anti-Sanders line, which is that he appeals to some of the same people that Trump does, which is what makes you literally definitionally electable. But again, there's such contempt. There's this expectation or this like demand that you just turn your backs on certain people. And again, this isn't about, you're not throwing anyone under the bus for the sake of anyone else. Like when you acknowledge the causes of that behavior.
When I finished that book on the Christian right, and I went in there with the prejudice of, the liberal class, where I kind of thought these people were all yahoos. And, I was at the Creationist Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky, where they had, I'm not making this up, a reconstruction of the Garden of Eden with T-Rex with a saddle, because Adam and Eve used to ride T-Rex around. And
they're on it, isn't there?
No, they're not on it. They're actually in the water and naked, but Eve's positioned so you can't see her plastic breasts or anything. And the guide is saying, well, I'm sure you all wonder why T-Rex has such big teeth. It's because they use T-Rex to open the coconuts. It's like that. Then we went into the Noah Ark exhibit, and how did they get dinosaurs on the Ark? Well, Noah only put baby's dinosaurs on the Ark.
Oh, that's so
is this
cute.
the Kentucky Museum?
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. That's one of my favorite places in the country. Yeah.
So, but I came away, I actually wrote my first chapter on the book was called Despair, because the stories that these people endured, the sexual assault, domestic violence, struggle with alcoholism, opioid, everything, bankruptcy, evictions were real. Yeah. And it thrust them into this world of magic Jesus.
Right.
And by the end of the book, I said, if you want to break the back of this movement, these people have to be reintegrated into the economy and the society. Otherwise, forget it. And of course, now it's worse.
Yeah, even if you have no empathy, just if you care about.
Yeah, but you can't hear those stories and not.
No, I know, but I have it. I think we all have it here at this table. Right. But even people who couldn't care less and who think that all these people have like a full set of teeth per family, all these like stereotypes.
Clichés,
yeah, even if they care about the victims of racism and sexism, misogyny, and homophobia, all the things they claim to care about, then we need to be addressing
Yeah, but
this.
the important thing to remember is that these people are being used. I mean, their despair is being manipulated by these mega pastors who are white male millionaires. Right. And people say, well, how can the evangelicals build an alliance with Trump? I say, no, you don't get it. The only difference between these megapastors and Trump, at least from my reporting, is that the sexual proclivities of the megapastors is probably kinkier. But they're the same people.
Right.
Totally. Joel Osteen. I mean, these people are just scum.
Right.
They are totally the same people.
Right.
It's actually the same legend of success.
Right.
Yeah.
You follow me and you'll get to
Yeah, he just talks about his sex life and they don't.
Is there? I feel like when I read your stuff now, that is there like a Studs Terkel element to the mission that you're going? I mean, essentially, I feel like you're filling a role of just relaying what the actual experiences of ordinary people are. Like that's kind of a form of reporting that's been devalued
it's
almost
called
completely.
Journalism.
Right? No, I understand.
That's what
that.
we should be doing.
That's what we should be doing.
We should be lifting up the voices who without us would not have a voice. That for me is the fundamental definition of journalism. It's what you do, and it's why I admire your work. And we've forgotten that. It's not about sitting around interviewing powerful people. That's puts you in the role of a courtier, not a journalist. So I kind of look at it as absolutely basic and fundamental to what it means to be a journalist. But unfortunately, that is, a vision that has just been completely marginalized within the media landscape. I
mean, the model now for being a reporter, what you just said, this really speaks to something that really bothers me, is that it so emphasizes the closeness to high-level sources, right?
Yeah.
Like that's who the big stars are in the business now, or the people who know 8 people in the NSA and the White House or whatever it is, and that's your daily news cycle, is a continuous series of updates.
And they lie to you and you repeat the lies. I mean, explain to me how that is journalism.
Right. And what you do, on the one hand, it's simple, right? You just walk outside, basically, right? But you have to be able to have the ability to empathize and connect and understand what the forces that are behind everything. And isn't that the job? I mean, it seems like... Yeah.
But it's also fun. I mean, I'm sure you feel it too. I like reporting.
Yeah.
I find it... I enjoy it. And I learn a lot. And my own expectations get shattered. It keeps you intellectually fresh. I mean, you're not, living off past capital. You're forced to go out. I'm writing a book now on prisons. I teach in prisons in New Jersey, but I'm driving around and interviewing the kids, interviewing the mothers in housing projects in Patterson and everywhere else. And we were talking before we started the show about Russell Banks. I think probably America's greatest novelist. But that's what keeps his stuff fresh. He's constantly going out, and his last book was he read an article in Miami about sex offenders living under a bridge. Right. And he went down there with a notebook and it's, so...
Right. And you do have to find a way to look at the world from their point of view, which is not always easy, right? But it seems like this prison experience of yours has really been it's exhilarating for you.
I love those guys.
Yeah. You teach, right, as well?
I teach through Rutgers, so I teach in their BA program,
I know we've had you on for a while already. Just a couple of things. Has the business of journalism changed at all in any in the last, 5 years or so? Like, what's your vision of how the business works these days? And especially the New York Times. It seems like even since you were there, they've changed their stodgy old ways a little bit. If you had any insights into that, they've had a lot of really interesting controversies in the last couple of years, including the release of that town hall with Dean Baquet and everything.
Well, the Times is a diminished organization. I mean, it's always an elitist publication, of course. I think for me the most disturbing thing is kind of what gravitas it had is gone. The book review is awful. The weekend review, the op-ed page. I mean, where do they find these people?
Brett Stevens.
First of all, they can't even write. Much less think. It's appalling.
I love him.
And then they kind of there's the tone is different. It's kind of Times light, I think. And because it's lost that gravitas, it spent 2 years slogging the whole Russiagate stuff, which I don't want to sit here and keep quoting you. You pointed out, I think you're right, is probably more devastating than selling us the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They're kind of morphing into MSNBC into print, and I hate MSNBC.
One of my favorite genres of New York Times coverage is how do the Israelis feel about this violence that they're inflicting on Palestinians?
That's nothing new. That is so old.
Actually, Chris has some unique insights there because you used to. You want to talk about that?
Well, the way it works. So let's say I was in Gaza when Israel carried out airstrikes against various Jabalia, various refugee camps. And so out of Tel Aviv, they go, a surgical airstrike against a bombing. Well, this is was great for me because I was there and I counted the bodies and I said, no, the whole street was destroyed. I mean, it was within the narrow confines of American journalism, I could expose the Israelis' the lie. So, but what they do is when you're writing about a particular assault, and this did not happen in other conflicts I covered for the New York Times, like Bosnia. Every other paragraph is the Israeli Defense Force spokesperson.
Right. Yeah.
So Ahmed says his entire family was killed by bomb. Well, in Tel Aviv, Colonel whoever says that's just completely untrue. Ahmed's family is perfectly fine, or whatever.
Right.
And so it's this kind of back and forth kaleidoscope, weird kind of journalism, and at the end of it you can believe whatever you want to believe, but it essentially mutes or dilutes so effectively the truth. Now, if I talked about a massacre in Bosnia,
right.
I was kind of required to try and call Belgrade or somewhere, Pale or something to get a no, we didn't do it or whatever.
Right.
But that was it. But that's not, you watch, that's how the New York Times will effectively disarm stories about atrocities against Palestinians,
And then, can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
So we talked about how Sanders brought up, Jeff Bezos not liking him, and maybe that's why he doesn't get a lot. He goes after Jeff Bezos. Maybe that's why he doesn't get a lot.
Well, the Times is pretty awful to him too.
Yes, totally. But when he said that statement about the Washington Post, all these people were scandalized and said it was a conspiracy theory. And we played audio of a woman, a reporter, being like, when you go after the standard that is the Washington Post, and even Marty Baron himself says it's a conspiracy theory, as if that's weird. He's like the first person who would say it's a conspiracy theory. But
the Marty Baron.
Yeah, the Marty Baron, like the person who has a conflict of interest with saying it's not a conspiracy theory. But I think a lot of people don't understand how this kind of narrative control works. I mean, I don't know. Is it censorship? Is it soft censorship? The way that people are kind of either self-selecting.
No, it's not censorship.
So what's the term?
It goes back to the point I made before that you know
right.
what the paper wants, and when I worked at the Times, you had I think 1,200 people who worked there. 1,150 knew damn well what was good for their career. Look,
right.
Everybody who covers the Middle, I'm very outspoken against Israel. But everybody who covers the Middle East, everyone, they don't argue with any of my opinions. They just don't say in public.
Right.
Sure.
Because it's not good for the career.
Right.
And institutions like the Times or the Post hire primarily careerists.
Right.
That's how you get there, and that is how you advance. And so, they can have this kind of faux notion of impartiality and objectivity and the truth and, all this stuff you get fed. But that's not how it works.
Well, that was great. I mean, you know what they say about the second time around with Chris Hedges? It's even better than the first.
Is that what they say about the second time around with Chris Hedges?
Right?
All right. Excellent.
Yeah. So that was Chris.
Yeah.
Chris Hedges. Great
The
interview.
Chris Hedges.
The Chris Hedges. And THC.
THC? The Hedges Chris?
TCH.
Right.
Okay, yeah. I was just making sure you're on your toes.
That was great. That was Chris Hedges, and thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for listening to Useful Idiots, and we will see you next week. Don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes so we can
screw Pod Save
rush.
America. Those people suck.